It is now my pleasure to introduce Larry Genstil. Larry is a psychologist with a master's and PhD from the University of Southern California. Originally from Los Angeles, he has lived in Israel since 1986 and has worked for many years with people with PWS. In 1993, Larry founded and directed a PWS group home in Israel right through to 2020. He is now retained as a consultant to this home. He has also been the psychologist at the PWS Multidisciplinary Clinic at Sharazak Medical Center in Jerusalem from 1996. Larry has served for many years as a member of the Professional Providers and Caregivers Board of IPWSO. Larry will now talk to us about education and Prader-Willi syndrome.
Most children with PWS, I think all of us know this, but anyway, they need highly structured, consistent learning with little or no change. Attention deficit disorder is very common, and that emphasizes the need for structure. Next slide. In terms of integrating in the classroom, seating is important because we'll talk later about this, but children with PWS often have visual processing very, very well and auditory processing less well. So sitting them in the front of the class allows them to function better. Often with older children, if they're in a class, a single child with PWS in a classroom, if that child presented about the syndrome to the other children and what the issues are, the other children usually accept it and they're empathic, and it really helps them integrate. Also, reinforcing academic areas in which the PWS child excels helps, because obviously they have weaker areas too. And so if they're good in something, they impacts their self-esteem and so on. Next slide. Classroom needs to be very structured. We've said that. Consistency. Classroom rules are consistent. Next slide. Planned classroom activities which are appropriate for the PWS child, they also have to take into account any food that is part of it. In Israel, food is a part of almost everything, and therefore we're very careful with the kind of activities and the kinds of foods. And for us, we get our approval from our dietitian before any food is given for any activity. Next slide. Social skills. PWS children learn social skills differently than many other children. Normal children learn by experience, imitation, and so on. But PWS children usually need to learn social skills in a structured way. They can be taught, many special education pupils need to be taught social skills, and this is especially so for the PWS child. Next slide. So social skills training, the way we do it, we discuss a specific skill to be learned. If it's carrying on a conversation, asking a question, requesting something, taking turns, whatever it is, we discuss the skill, we demonstrate the skill via role playing. Somebody role plays the skill. Then we ask the child to role play it back with video if possible. Now we can all film from our cell phones, so it's very easy. And 15, 20 years ago, it was much more difficult. So we try and video a lot of things because, again, the children are very visual and not so auditory. Then we have the child give feedback on his own performance. We ask things like, which Tommy would you choose as a friend? Which Tommy would you want the world to see? Those kinds of questions. Then behavior rehearsal on the new skill and reinforcing the use of the new behavior. Next slide. Empathy. Norbert is here. He developed this. He can explain it better than I, but I'm presenting now. So at any rate, most children with PWS don't really have empathy. They're really concerned with themselves, but it can be taught, and he showed us how. Next slide. Pictures are shown of faces of people with expressed emotions, surprise, anger, joy, disappointment, whatever. A picture is shown, the children are asked what feeling is being expressed, then the feeling is discussed, which children have felt the same feeling before, what happened, how did they deal with it, how did others feel, how did they make others feel, how did they understand how others felt. Then role play the situations in which the PWS child and the other pupils in the class recognize the feeling in another and how they respond appropriately. And then do this with other feelings as well, and reinforce the children's empathic behaviors. Um, it doesn't generalize from one feeling to another. Each one needs to be done separately. Behavioral issues. Food stealing is one of the most important behavioral issues that needs to be addressed always. Um, Obviously, food needs to be not accessible as much as possible with maximum supervision. Have the children's backpacks or bags out of sight. Empty garbage cans frequently. Playground supervision. Never leave the child alone. The child should be aware that he has no access, that's food security. Guided imagery in which the child can even imagine that he sees food and doesn't take it, and role playing with video feedback. I want to give two examples. A girl in our group home has told us that when she was in high school, if she saw a, one of the students' bags and she knew it had a sandwich in it, she was concentrating on the sandwich. She was not able to concentrate on what happened in the classroom. And this is a very good um, example of how they tune out everything except for um, the food, the possibility of getting food. Um, and oh wait, the other thing, I had another point. I'll come back to it. Okay, next slide, please. With role playing, we once had a man role play how he was able to get food, and he saw himself doing it, and he was so embarrassed. He said, "Do I look like that?" And then he didn't do it again for a long time. It had a very strong effect when he saw himself on TV stealing food. Temper tantrums with a recognized trigger. Um, And the way we respond to that, first of all, if we know that there's a trigger like food stealing or child refusing to do what we've asked, or us refusing a child's request, then we know there's a triggers. So when a trigger occurs, if we can change the routine, often that prevents the tantrum. Then we can reinforce non-tantrum behaviors. Relaxation exercises, we do a lot of that because that reduces the level of stress in all of us. And the other thing, if we can distract the children with humor, that really works well. It reduces the level of stress and tension they're feeling. And the children know that I use humor all the time. The children are residents, they're not children anymore. They know that I use humor all the time. And when I feel tension, I'll come out and I'll say, today you've had your breakfast, but now the rest of the day we're fasting. And now they know me well. If they just crack up, they all laugh. And that really helps because then the tension goes down and then we can resume the day in a much calmer way. And so we have the child role play a tantrum and role play how he could have handled the same situation better. And he sees himself not negatively and positively. And we ask him questions like, which Tom would you like the world to see? Which Tom would you want as a friend? And those kinds of questions help them. I've been asked what kind of relaxation exercises. We're doing two kinds. One is on YouTube under relaxation. There are just auditory things, people talking and background music, or with video, you'll see nature scenes and nature sounds and background music. They're very relaxing. We put that on every day for like 10, 12 minutes. Children, the residents sit and relax. Or I also will do a relaxation technique where they visualize the tensions rising up like steam up and off the bodies and so on and so on. There are lots and lots of relaxation. You can find them on YouTube and on the internet. I'm not so good at finding things on the internet, but other people are, and we've found a lot of examples, and it's very effective. I want to emphasize the humor too. If you see a trigger occurring, if you can have the child laugh about anything, the chances are great the tantrum won't occur, and we use humor as much as we can. Next screen, please. At all times during a tantrum, low attention. Give as little attention as possible because any attention can have the behavior escalate. And the other thing is that we're not always aware of what is attention. It's obvious talking or touching is attention getting or giving, but even eye contact can reinforce, and therefore we try not to do anything. Of course, if there's danger involved, then we have to intervene, but if it's not dangerous, we try not to attend at all, not to reinforce. And low expressed emotion on our part does not allow the child to use our responses to escalate. If we raise our voice in response to a child shouting, that's going to escalate him even more. Next slide, please. Reinforcing non-tantrum behaviors when similar situations arise later, that really helps. Relaxation exercises, giving a child a disc or recording of the relaxation exercise to listen whenever he feels the need. And we have children listening to these things frequently on their own. In all cases, frequent talks about behavior helps. It's an issue that we talk about and they talk about. And frequent behavior rehearsal of the issues around which the tantrums occur, like food stealing or saying no or not wanting to do their physical activity. I don't feel well, my stomach hurts, my leg hurts. Those are kinds of issues that frequently can cause a tantrum. Next slide, please. Obsessive compulsive disorders are very, very common with the syndrome. Compulsive behaviors that are common are hoarding, rectal picking, paper tearing, compulsive question asking. Some of these behaviors occur in order for the child to feel more in control, and therefore allowing for more self-control may help. Next slide. Behavior modification helps to a degree, not always, but it can help. Relaxation exercises reduce anxiety, which is a factor in OCD. A structured, consistent environment helps, and as little dead time as possible. And in a group home setting, this is difficult because, like when the residents are taking showers, we don't have a shower for each person, so they take turns, so there's dead time. Or sometimes waiting for a meal or after the meal when there's not something structured. In the classroom, I can imagine that if the teacher gives an assignment and the children do it independently, for the PWS child, that could be dead time. Dead time allows them the opportunity to act out. So as little dead time as possible and maximal supervision. Next slide, please. Rigidity and inflexibility are very, very difficult behaviors that are a very strong part of the syndrome. Sometimes we see people that when they get upset, they're much more stubborn, much more rigid. And when they're not upset, that they're more flexible. But it just depends on the person. But when a person starts that, what we say, like he puts himself in a corner, when he starts becoming stubborn or inflexible, coaxing, persuading, arguing, demanding never helps. It makes them even more inflexible. Distracting often helps. Humor, and sometimes even tickling, often helps because it reduces the tension. And examples of the humor, like I said, sometimes I'll come in and they know me that I'm always joking. So I'll say, we're fasting today. So they laugh and the tension's gone. Sometimes nothing helps. And the best thing is to proceed in class without the PWS child's participation, especially when food is involved. This may help them rejoin the group, not always. Sometimes nothing helps. You just have to continue the program. Next slide, please. Food security. Doctors Linda Gourash and Janice Forster from Pittsburgh, they presented this many times in different conferences. They're wonderful. And they said food is stress. Food security includes no doubts about what will be provided and when, no hopes of obtaining food outside the plan, and no disappointments concerning food. Next. No doubts, that means there's no uncertainty about food. Advanced planning of meals with a meal plan, if you even posted, a schedule the day's events with the meals when they're going to be given, visual schedule posted for the children to see, verbal reminders of the plans, and never use food as a reward or a punisher. Next. No hopes, no opportunity or no chance to get food outside the plan. Food control, there's no access to food other than what they're supposed to get. Well-trained school staff, so the staff knows. And again, the children will look for the weakest link among the staff. And we've had staff people like the janitor or the guard or whatever give the children candy and all sorts of, it's always a problem. That's why the training is really paramount. Caregivers must avoid saying anything that could create doubts or hopes. Like, if you're good, then those kinds of statements make it worse, because then they expect. Once there's an expectation, there's a hope. And if the hope doesn't materialize, there's going to be a tantrum. Matter of fact, adherence to the plan in the face of manipulation, pestering, whining is an essential skill. They're going to manipulate, they're going to pester, they're going to whine, they're going to say, but like when I'm not there, they'll always say that Larry promised us. They use my name all the time. So in every staff meeting, I tell all the staff, if they use my name, it's automatically no. And it needs to be the same for anything. There's no manipulation that should get them anything other than what's in the plan. The presence of these behaviors indicates that food security is not yet achieved. And that's important, because once there's food security, then it's much easier to proceed with the day. Next slide. No disappointments. Managing expectations prevents disappointments. Disappointments are a major source of behavioral problems, especially tantrums. If the person expected to get something, he doesn't get it, he's in a tantrum. Next slide. Food control, all food needs to be locked such that there's no access to food or money. Supervision mandatory. Management of the physical environment is needed to achieve no hopes and to maintain weight. Food security is a psychological state of the individual. If he knows there's no food available, he's then able to participate in any activity that's going on. Food security improves behavior. Next slide. Okay, we talked about this a little bit before. In many Prader-Willi people, auditory processing is weaker than visual processing. It's not true for everybody, but it's true for many, I think most. The Prader-Willi child is often very verbal, which confuses us, because if he's verbal, we think he also understands what's being said. But verbal conversations have limited use unless we know the child really has no auditory processing problem. Only part of any verbal conversation is processed. Often the child's imagination fills in the missed content of the conversation, and their imaginations are very vivid. Often compulsive questioning is a result of only partial understanding of what was said. The children can ask, but you said this and you said that, and they'll argue and go on and on and on and on. Or I hear all the time, but this counselor is supposed to come today at 3:00. Where is he? He's supposed to come? But he's supposed to come. He told me yesterday he's coming today. And they'll go on and on and on. The verbal memory is less acute than the visual. When we get this compulsive questioning, one of the things that's easiest for me, if they read, most of ours do read, we write out one sentence summary of what was said. We give it to them, they read it, and that's it. The questioning stops. Next slide. Visual processing the PWS child is often above the average of a normal child. All classroom activities should have a visual component. Other special education children might also be better visually than auditorily. Thus, for all pupils, a visual component is helpful. All communication learning need to have a visual component. Years ago in our group, when we had a deaf girl, she didn't have PWS, but she was very overweight. And she taught all of us sign language. I'm very auditory, not very, very visual, and I had a hard time, but they picked it up. They were carrying on conversations with each other with sign language because their visual memory is so good. They picked it up quickly and they used it for years after she left even. Now it's been like 15 years, now it's gone by the wayside. But any visual communication is helpful for them. Next slide, please. Examples of visual components, like I've said, sign language, gestures, facial expressions, written communication, pictures, communication via puppets, role-playing, anything visual, anything visual. Next slide, please. The parent needs to be very involved because the parent knows the syndrome better than school staff, at least in the beginning. The parent knows the child better than the school staff, at least in the beginning, and there may occur behaviors in school that the parent already deals with successfully and could contribute to the staff's success. So we try and involve our parents as much as possible. With us now, we've had residents by us for over 20 years, some of them. So we know the children at least as well as the parents. But in a school situation, that's not necessarily so, especially in the beginning. Next slide. In Israel, we discovered most of the children with normal IQs that were in regular education by junior high, they transfer to special ed because the services aren't enough to enable them to progress the way they should. Now it's better in Israel. In the old days, it was not. There were no services in regular education. Now there are more. So it's more possible. I don't know what the percentage would be in any other country. I assume it's probably the same all over the world. But in all the conferences that I've been to, and I've been going to conferences since 2003, I've never heard this discussed before, that there are a sizable group of people with PWS that have normal IQs and learn in regular education. There have been examples of these, like in the US conferences, there have been students that present, but it hasn't been done as in terms of what services are required to help them maintain in a regular setting. I think that's important, and I hope hopefully that you and your different countries can look at that when you discover the children that fit this category. Next slide, please. The girls integrated socially better than the boys, which surprised me. And there were relatively fewer tantruming behaviors. The parents thought this is because their children imitated more pro-social behaviors from the other children. I don't know if that's true, but that's what the parents thought, and it was true that there were fewer tantrums. Next slide. Classroom presentation. This is classroom presentation of regular students on PWS, allowing them to understand. So we've had students, I'm being asked now, what types of visual prompts do you think would best to use in interviews, focus groups? The best visual prompt is sign language, but not of us. I don't know sign language, and most of us do not. Facial expressions are important. Hand gestures are important. Written summaries are crucial. Things written on the blackboard or on the computer can help. Any kind of visual cueing helps. If we see there's a child that only gets a certain percentage of what was said. We've had children present to their peers in class about the syndrome. In every case that we've done that, and I'm saying this is probably 8 or 10, in every case where the class was like above 4th or 5th grade, the other children empathized, accepted, and were sympathetic and even helpful to the PWS student. It was very successful. When professionals presented, there was not this kind of success. It was when the child himself presented. And it takes a lot of guts for a child to say, this is me and this is what I do. But when they did it, it was very successful. Also, in Israel, sometimes it's possible to get a shadow aid for the PWS student in a regular class. And that person then helps with food and behavioral issues and organization of learning, which is very helpful. And that can allow a student to really succeed. And that's just been within the last 4 or 5, 6 years. Before that, they didn't have shadow aids in Israel for this. Next slide, please. Behaviorally typical PWS behaviors impacted social integration, the worst of which was a tendency to interfere and ask perseverative questions and so on. Other areas of concern were behavior, low emotional intelligence, and food acquisition behaviors. Next slide. Services for all PWS children in a classroom would include, this is not the purview of the school, but growth hormone from early as possible, as long as possible, and physical activity as much as possible. With improves coordination, muscle mass, reduces hypotonia. Next slide. Allow each PWS student to sit in front row in order to allow for more visual learning. Allow for role playing with video feedback on an individual basis or even in a group basis. Often this can be done with a shadow aid if there is one. In order to teach more pro-social behaviors in special education, I think this should be done anyway. Next slide. Breaking learning tasks down into smaller subtasks usually helps because they're very concrete learners, usually, not always. Behavior modification component in a program can help. Next slide. Empathy training the way that Norbert Hodebeck-Stonebeck described is excellent. Social skills training via role-playing and with video feedback helps. Next slide. Impulse control training via role-playing with video feedback can help. When we know that a certain behavior can cause an impulsive response, you can role-play various responses to the same activity that can cause the impulse, and they then have a way to choose other responses to that same thing that can cause the behavior. Ongoing training of all staff with PWS is crucial all the time. And in our experience, it needs to be done again and again and again, because when people have been trained and then they go on a while without ongoing training, they begin to respond again based on how each person responds normally and not based on what should be done. Psychotherapy for the predator-worthy child can always be helpful, depending. A lot of cognitive behavior, a lot of treatment involving guided imagery, relaxation, having them talk about feelings and become more aware of their own feelings and not just reacting based on feelings, and so on. Next slide.